Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Tonight's tale, Purple Skies, by the superlatively named Holy Heretic. In the United States of America, in the state of Ohio, about 45 minutes northwest of Cincinnati, there is a large but sparsely populated farming community known as Oregonia. Some of you who have an interest in motorcycles may have heard of it before, as the community is famous for its hills. So famous, it holds the annual Devil's Staircase hill climb, where motorcyclists ride their bikes up a very steep hill. It's a lot more fun than it sounds, and it brings a lot of money and excitement to what is normally a very boring area. These hills are steep, and they are many. Within the valleys around Oregonia, you will find abandoned houses, mines, caves, and a lot of wild game. Every child who grows up there will become familiar with these hills, as they will have nothing better to do than walk them and explore. But, as every child in Oregonia knows, these valleys are dangerous, and if there's something you should never do in Oregonia, it isn't walk the waterfront with a fat wallet or badmouth Ralph J. Stoley. It's that you never walk the valleys during a purple sky. Now, purple skies mean different things to different people. Usually it means a storm is coming, or it's just an odd quirk of the sunset, but some people believe it has a different, more spiritual meaning. Some people think it means death is close, or that a lot of people somewhere have died. For the Shawnee who used to live in the valleys, it was an omen favoring war. Me, I just know to stay inside when it happens, because I didn't once, and I almost never made it back home. My story begins as most of my childhood stories begin. I was walking the valleys of Oregonia. It was a warm winter day, and I was alone, scouting the hills a few miles away from my house, looking for dens of deer to hunt next season. I was 13. We didn't have cell phones back then, nor did I have a GPS, but I always knew where I was. Some locals may claim that the hills are hard to navigate, but in reality it's pretty easy. Just follow the water if you ever get lost. Almost every valley has a creek at the bottom, and you can follow them all the way to the river, where you can find the bike trail and the waterfront district of Oregonia. And the highway isn't far from there. Getting lost in the valleys may be easy, but staying that way is much more difficult. I had discovered a new valley, at least a new one to me, as I had strayed farther from home than I ever had before. Now, this may sound boring, but for a chronically bored country kid, pretending to be an explorer in an unknown territory is far more fun than any video game. I was so absorbed, I lost track of time. I came to my senses when I heard the drums. 10 beats echoing loudly throughout the hills. I shrugged it off as hearing an echoing gunshot or a car backfiring, and coming to my senses, I finally checked out my watch. It was 8 o'clock p.m., but the sun sat on the edge of the sky. I chalked it up to a bad battery, and having had my fill of exploring for the day, I started to make my way back home. I began by climbing the hill behind me, following my own tracks, trying to get back to a place I recognized. When I got to the top of the hill, I found myself in an odd situation. I didn't recognize where I was. I was high up enough to see anything I wanted. I could have seen my house on top of the hill 3 miles away to the north. I could have seen Mr. Carroll's ranch to the east. I could have seen the highway to the west. I could have been able to see the river at the bottom of the valley. but I didn't. None of it was there. I turned around thinking maybe I was simply disoriented, but at the top of each hill, I just saw trees and bushes. Except for one hill just in front of the setting sun to the east. I saw a smokestack silhouetted against the beautiful purple sky. Now, campfires are not uncommon in Oregonia, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. I heard the drums again. This time it was 9 beats, all in a row, echoing throughout the valleys. I shrugged it off again as a gun firing. Again. See, they're common in Oregonia. Using the sun as a reference point, I found my way. I needed to head west, the way that the river flowed. I would run into a creek eventually and get my bearings. It took me half an hour to descend the hill and walk into the valley looking for evidence of a creek bed. I checked my watch as the ground leveled out. Now it was almost 9. The sun hung on the edge of the eastern sky. It hadn't moved. I remember telling myself that this was simply an illusion or a quirk of the way I was looking at it. I worried more about how angry my parents would be with me for coming home after dark, because at the rate I was going, it would be another hour or so before I could find my way home. If only. I walked the flat of the valley until it ended. I knew that I had to be close to the river, and the hill that I was at was high, so I figured that I would probably see something if I climbed it. And while I climbed, I heard the drums again. 8 beats. Still, I ignored it. I got to the top of the hill, and to my dismay, I found I recognized nothing yet again. Now I chuckled to myself. My dad was never going to let me live this down, not getting lost in Oregonia. When we hunted, I was often his navigator. I could tell my way just by seeing individual trees. So I looked in all directions, nothing north or south or west. But to the east was the still setting sun. I looked at my watch. It was 10 o'clock. 2 hours and the sun hadn't moved. I took off my watch. I knew the sun was setting. Nothing stops the sun from setting. I still ignored the signs, save for one, the smokestack. While my back was turned, it had grown. Now it was in a valley, closer to me. 7 beats echoed throughout the hills. That's when I began paying attention to the drums. They were louder this time. I began to get a little panicked. I enjoyed the solitude of Oregonia more than most, but even I had my limits. I tried to ignore the drums, and I even wondered if they were real or if they were my imagination. But I did what I had been told to do if ever I was lost. I pulled out my knife and marked the nearest tree with an X. Then I moved west, my back to the sun and to the smokestack. I made my way down the hill, marking each tree that I passed with another X. Like a roller coaster, walking in Oregonia only takes you down for so long. Before I knew it, I was climbing a hill again. 6 beats. I turned around to face the smokestack. It was closer still, and the sun still hadn't moved. I grabbed a long stick and sharpened the end with my knife. I told myself it was for coyotes and wild dogs, but I knew something primal in my head kicked in, and I knew I was being hunted. I began to hurry down the hill, quickly marking my X's and keeping my stick handy. I hurried so quickly that at one point I tripped on a rock. I rolled and rolled, trying to stop myself by grabbing onto, well, anything, but the hill was too steep and the ground was too hard. I caught a hold of a root for a moment, but then I pulled it out, straight out of the ground. I tucked in and rolled to the bottom, hitting my head on a rock when I finally stopped. 5 beats. Something moved in the woods in front of me, but I couldn't tell what it was. On the way down, I had dropped my knife and my stick. I got up and turned around. I was in a clearing, surrounded on all sides by a thick forest of trees, and all of them had X's on them. 4 beats. I turned east, and to my horror, the smokestack was only 1 valley away. The sun still hadn't moved. I grabbed a few rocks and sticks and moved up a hill. All the trees still had X's on them. I couldn't tell if I'd been there before. Now, some of the X's looked like they were cut with metal into bark, while others looked wider, less clean, like they had been carved with stone. I didn't care anymore. I was going home. I was finding shelter, damn it. Just before I got to the top of the hill, I found exactly what I was looking for. A cave, as several of them dot the landscape of Oregonia. It faced east towards the smokestack and toward the rising of the sun. 3 beats. I set up a fire pit and began hurriedly making a fire. It hadn't snowed or rained in days, so making a fire even without any flint wasn't really that difficult. I got a few sparks going against the dry leaves, and as I leaned in to blow into the flames, I felt something fall onto my back, and I plummeted face first into the fire pit. I got up with one of my sticks handy. Someone had kicked me into that fire. 2 beats. I grabbed a rock, and I sharpened a stick as best I could, and then backed slowly into the cave. The smokestack was in my valley now. All the birds and bats in the trees started to fly away, and all the rats inside the cave ran outside. Someone tapped me twice on the shoulder. I turned around to see nothing but empty cave and a shadow on the wall. 2 shadows. I sprinted forward into the cave, screaming. I heard that final drum beat, and before I knew it, the smoke wasn't in the valley anymore, but in the cave. With me, I was being smoked out. Hardly able to breathe, I kept pressing west, deeper into the cave. In the briefest flashes of light that I was allowed, I swear that I saw drawings inside the caves, drawings of men slaying animals. I ran into a rock wall, but I noticed a ray of light from above me. I clawed onto the wall and began climbing towards the light. The hole up there was only big enough for my head, but I used my stick as a makeshift shovel to beat back some of the dirt and rocks. It eventually got big enough for me to climb through. I put my right arm up first and tried to pull myself up, but it wasn't quite large enough. Then something grabbed a hold of my leg. I pulled, and so did it, and it was winning. I screamed for help, and I tried grabbing on to anything to pull myself out of the cave. I got a hold of a root and began pulling as hard as I could. I kicked whatever had a hold of my leg and pulled myself up. I was almost all the way through when something grabbed my left leg again and pulled. I had leverage this time, and I pulled harder than I ever had before. I felt my shoe and sock come off as I pulled free of the ground. I rolled away from the hole and onto a paved road. I lay there for a few moments, watching the moon. It was a hunter's moon, and it was the most beautiful thing that I'd ever seen. I sat up and saw my leg. Whatever had a hold of me hadn't just taken my shoe and sock, it had taken all of the skin below the knee. It had been flayed off It looked like with a knife. I, I, I checked my watch. It was 1 o'clock. A group of kids out late passed me on the road a little later, and they got me to a hospital. My leg eventually healed with time. I told my parents that I had simply been lost. I lived to walk the valleys again, but after that day, I never went out when there was a purple sky. So stay scary, wildlings, and try to make the most of your nights.